This is the Shenley Christian Fellowship Podcast, an almost weekly broadcast of the Sunday morning talk at our church in Milton Keynes. To find out more about Shenley Christian Fellowship, visit scf-mk.org.uk.
Well, we're going to continue in our story in Genesis. We've skipped a chapter 14, and we're on to chapter 15. And I'm going to start by reading the sort of first half of that chapter, and we'll pick up the story. I hope you've been in the last few weeks. Well, last week we did something a bit different, but in previous weeks I hope you'll pick up the story of Abram. He's still Abram, not quite Abraham, but he will be soon. And here's the story. Chapter 15 and verse 1. Of Genesis. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abraham said, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abraham said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? We start with a reminder of the kind of yo-yo character. If Elijah had his ups and downs, as we heard about a few minutes ago, well, Abram, he also had his ups and downs, a bit like a yo-yo. But God is here promising protection. He says in verse 1, I am your shield. We've missed chapter 14, which was all about battles. And God is just reminding Abram, I am with you. I am your shield. I am your protector. I will be with you. Haven't I just proved it from the previous chapter? Don't you know that I'm going to be your shield and your protector from enemies and battles? And we're moving on. Our hero of faith, Abram, just 2 chapters ago, sold his wife's virtue to save his own skin. Some hero we've got here. And now he's in his mid-80s. Do heroes come in their mid-80s? They do in the Bible. Well past his midlife crisis. He had several crises, Abraham, at various stages in his life. But here are some of the principles, and we're going to have a look at that. Abraham's 4 stages of walking with God. And the first thing is he was in touch with God. Throughout the previous few chapters, every time we get a dialogue about Abraham, it's a dialogue with God. He's in constant touch with God. He's praying, he's talking, he's listening, he's debating, he's chatting. He sees a vision. He hears the Lord. The word of the Lord came. And for 2 nights and 2 days in this particular bit of the story, God is in dialogue with Abraham. You know, one of the principles here about faith and walking in faith is we've got to be in touch with God. We've got to be in touch with God. And I don't know about you, but part of this story for me, the real challenge for me personally, a bit different for all of us, but for me personally is, am I in touch with God? Do I hear that little talk? Do I hear that word from the Lord? Do I see that vision? Do I get that appearance? What is going on with me and God? What's going on between you and God? Are you in touch with God on a regular basis? Because that is at the heart of the story that we're reading today. And it goes on. He heard his message. Verse 4, Then the word of the Lord came to Abraham. this man will not be your heir. It's a funny bit of the story, really, because in verse 3, Abraham's saying to God, in this little dialogue, God, I just want to remind you about the facts of life. I can't have a family without children. Strange, really, to talk to God, because 15 chapters earlier, God created not only the universe, but the first man and woman. And since then, he'd been creating other people. So God kind of was at least one or two steps ahead of Abraham in this particular bit of science. And I think he probably knew how to populate the world rather better than Abraham did. But Abraham says, well, I haven't got an heir. God has got an heir. God's got a plan for Abraham, and he just needs to rest and remind himself that he just needs to listen and walk in step with God's plan and his purpose. And then the third step, you see a beginning of a cycle here. In verse 6, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. That's that really famous verse. Abraham believed the Lord. This was the high point in the yo-yo experience. Abraham goes up and down, but this is a high point. And he takes him in the previous verse to get Abraham to the point of verse 6 where he believed. He takes him out and he gives him a little astronomy lesson. You've had the I created individuals. Now you're going out, Abraham, and you're going to have another look at something else I've created. And he goes out and he says, just count the stars. Now, in Milton Keynes, that's kind of on a night, that's kind of reasonably easy. You could have a bash at that. But out in the Middle East, with no lights of a city round you, in the middle of nowhere, there are, I gather, 8,000 stars that you can count just with the naked eye, let alone a telescope. I just got this wonderful picture of Abraham going out and saying, right, okay, I'll prove your point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do I count the shooting ones as well? Well, that's moving, God. Would you keep them still while I keep counting them? 8,000 stars that you can see. Many, many, many more that you can't. And we don't even know today how many there are. And God says to Abraham, just trust me, I've got a plan. I had a plan before the beginning of time, and it will go right through to the end of time. And you just need to be resting in me. You know, there's something about going out into God's creation that gives us a different perspective, isn't it? It just gives us a different viewpoint. And Abraham just needed a reminder that, well, from my perspective, says God, things look a little different. And you just need to trust. You just need to walk with me and believe and have faith. I don't know whether some of we're city dwellers, most of us here. We're not in the country. Maybe we need to get out and see the country, see God's creation, see his handiwork a bit more. Because some of the most inspiring times I've had, I know, have not been sitting in a city. They've been out in the countryside. They've been looking at God's creation, and suddenly life comes in a different perspective. I see the handiwork of God, and I think, it puts my life into perspective. Maybe some of our London city dwellers would see the crisis at the moment with a different perspective if they went out and they found out a bit more about the person who owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. It's God. God has command over all things. Abraham, I have command over all things. People, nations, the stars, the universe, life, the universe, and everything. That's in my plan. But to give Abraham his credit, one look at the stars, one astronomy lesson, and he believed that the Lord did have a plan. And then, there's one thing believing, but actually, we've got to walk in faith and we've got to trust. What about the land? You see, the people were one thing, but the second promise was about the land. So the land will be yours as well by faith. And Abraham just has to walk in faith. Impatiently, imperfectly, rather like us, really. We don't find it very easy just walking in faith. We've got our own plans, our own purposes, but sometimes we need to go back to the beginning of the cycle, don't we? And just listen for the next part of the jigsaw, the next part of the plan. And I don't know about you, but that's the bit that I find most difficult. I can trust God in some things, and I get to a point, a bit like Abraham, and I think, well, I can plan the last bit, God. I'm okay on that. You've got me this far, thanks very much, but I can see where you're going now, and I will take the next step. And of course, Abraham does that on lots of occasions throughout his life. He tries to take the next step. But you see, this isn't a one-off experience. It's a kind of iterative process. It goes on and on, because that's what God wants of Abraham. He wants it of us as well. He wants us to listen. He wants us to dialogue. He wants us to be in touch with him. And he wants us to believe in his promises and to walk in faith. And then he wants us to listen again. Somebody shared in a meeting just recently, just what I'd already sort of prepared in this bit, which is about your muscles. How are your spiritual muscles? Because it's only through testing. Sorry, sporting analogies starting to come out again here, Tim. It's only by testing and flexing those muscles that we actually grow and we develop and our faith expands and we can believe God for more and we can trust him for more. So my challenge this morning, one of the challenges that this passage seems to bring is how are your spiritual biceps, your pectorals, your calf muscles, how are they? Your spiritual ones. Where are you on the cycle right now at the moment? What's the difficult bit that you're struggling with? Because God longs to move us on. If it's for you a moment to stand still and listen and see God, then start there. If it's actually, I've heard God, but I just don't know whether to take that step of faith. Can I believe in his promises? And can I action them? Maybe it's there that you're struggling on something. But at each stage, God comes alongside and says, I long more than anything else to see you just grow in your faith and trust of me. And that's what he's teaching Abraham on all these pages. That's what it's all about. Yes, he's got a master plan of a people, a nation, a blessing for them, but it's about faith and it's just growing his faith. How can we emulate this model in our lives? I don't know about you, but one of the things that I find helpful is to remember God's faithfulness. We were talking about this in our growth group recently. Remember God's faithfulness in the past, and you can trust him for just a bit more in the future. How do you remember God's faithfulness in the past? What are the things that you do? This was a great thing in the Old Testament. They often built altars or cairns or memorials or things that reminded them of what God had done in the past, so that generations ahead they'd be able to look back and they say, well, God did it there. He did it at the crossing of the Red Sea, so why can't he do it at the Jordan? It was a memorial. It was a reminder. God doesn't change, so why can't we apply the same principles, same situation? What are your markers? What do you put down as reminders of God's faithfulness that you can look back on and say, he did it there, I'm going to trust him again the next time round? Maybe it's a little plaque in your home, a fridge magnet, something on your mantelpiece. Maybe it's an experience you had when you were, maybe years ago, and you went to, a Christian festival. I've just been with all the Christian festival leaders earlier this week, which is an inspiring day of meeting and hearing some of the stories of tens of thousands of people around the country that are going to festivals, and their lives are being changed as a result. And maybe it's time to go back. For my wife and I, Beth and I, we had a terrific experience on 2 occasions at Capernwray. Some of you, I know, go to Capernwray. And that was over 20 years ago. And I'm going back next month to go to Capernwray to speak there. And I just want to say to the people there that are students, I had a life-changing experience at this place over 20 years ago. God took me on in my faith in a particular way, and I want to come back, and I just want to remember that, and I want to take it on further. I don't want to rest in that, of what he's done in the past. I want to use that as a springboard to the future, springboard to the second half. Maybe there's something that you have. I know I've got a friend who's got a little notebook. He keeps a little notebook, and he's very faithful. He's so disciplined. I couldn't. This isn't for me, but or maybe it should be. And he writes in it, I prayed for this today. And I remember being with him a couple of years ago, and he opened the book, and it was like ages ago, and we'd been talking about something way more than a year before. And he said, I prayed for that, And we talked about that, didn't we? And it's happened. And it was his little marker in his notebook that reminded him, well, God did it then, so let's trust him again, Jim, for the next stage. How's our faith building? What have we done to show that we've got faith in God? What challenge is God putting ahead of us right now that we can grow that more in trusting who God is? Let's move on. There are 3 promises that you've probably picked out of this passage. God's 3 promises to Abraham that we all know well, I'm sure if you know this story. The first promise, the promise of children. And as he looks up to those stars, those 8,000 stars, God says to him, you might think this is amazing. You might think this is humanly impossible. It is. But just trust me, I've got a plan. Thousands of years later, there was a guy called Zachariah who was told that his wife Elizabeth was going to have a baby. And he severely doubted that. And God silenced him for quite a long time. Until the baby was born. And Zachariah then had to choose in obedience how he was going to name that child. And he said the name of the child will be John. And at that moment, his tongue was loosed and he could speak again. Abraham believed God on this one. And it was credited to him as righteousness. But God's plans for Abraham were very long term. It's easy if you see the result very soon, isn't it? But what happens if you never see the result? Countless stories of faith in the Old Testament, the people concerned, they don't see the end result. Not in their lifetime. Not in their children's lifetime. Not in their grandchildren's life. Not the great-grandchildren's life. 4 generations in this case. Well, we may not be called to found a nation. We might be just called to be part of a community of Christ's church. But God promised, and Abraham waited. With failings, yeah, but he waited. And he waited. God's delay isn't a denial, is it? In our prayers. You're praying for something at the moment, and you're praying and praying and praying, and, well, God's got a plan. It reminds me of time. You see, there are 2 types of time that come up in the Bible. There's chronos time. That's the watch time. And there's kairos time, which is spirit time. It's time to come to church, that's chronos time. It's Christmas time, it's chronos time. But there's kairos time. That was God's timing for that to happen. In that way, at that time. And here, Abraham is just like us. He lives in chronos time all the time. Well, when's it going to happen? You've told me, I'm in my mid-80s, come on, God, what's going to happen? When's it going to happen? I'm running out of time. He said you ran out of time long time ago, Abraham. You ran out of chronos time, but I've got kairos time. It's different. It's my perfect timing. And I don't know about you, but this is one of the things I find most difficult, to live in God's kairos timing, his perfect timing, where we just have to live and trust, not dictated to by calendars and events, but God's perfect perspective on what's going on. Lots of stories in the Bible about faith. They do not see the results. Moses did an amazing job. A great hero. Never actually went in to the promised land. It was Joshua. that took the people into the promised land. You know, it may be like that if we're building a church. I'll just throw this in as a thought. As we're thinking about building a church, we may be building a church. We may be building a building in years to come. We may not see the fruit of our labour. All we're called to do is to be obedient to God. When that time comes, when He speaks to us, then we just need to be obedient and walk in His ways. And I know we're trying to listen to hear God's plan in that situation. But God is most interested in whether we're just being obedient and faithful. And it may be future generations, it may not even be our children or our grandchildren that benefit, but God will have a plan and a purpose. As the speaker last week said, a disciple of Jesus Christ is simply called to be obedient. Well, the second half of this chapter is a strange story, which we haven't got time to go into much, but it's a strange story of a covenant. We probably think of covenants now as bits of paper. I've got bits of paper here that are covenants for land and marriage and various bits of here, and they're sealed not with the blood of animals, as the story goes on to talk about, but just a bit of red ink and a sort of seal. Not exactly the same as the covenant that's described in the second part of this chapter, when God cuts the animals, or God tells Abraham to cut the animal, and he walks through it, as it were, with fire through it. And this is a pledge to Abraham. And he says this: as the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces of the animals. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. Sacrifice was the way of showing that covenant in those days. And there's another covenant, of course, today, through sacrifice, through the sacrifice that we've just shared together in communion. That promise that one day we will have eternal life. So he had a promise of children and a promise of a nation, the boundaries of which were defined here by God. And it was 400 years, over 400 years, 4 generations before actually the descendants would come back to that land and actually see that thing fulfilled. And finally, there's the promise of a blessing. Just going back to verse 1, Abraham's told by God, don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward. I will give you, Abraham, a blessing beyond the land, the people. I will give you a blessing that is beyond anything you can imagine. The words of Hebrews 11:10, Abraham was waiting for a city that was designed and built by God. And we read about it in Revelation at the end of time. God at the beginning of time and God at the end of the time. He has a plan, he has a purpose, and he has a city waiting for Abraham. And the great news is he's got a city waiting for us. And you can read about that fantastic stories we've done fairly recently as a church in Revelation. That God has an ultimate blessing for us, the promise of a heavenly reward. Well, let's finish just by thinking faith isn't faith if we begin to see it. Do you remember Hebrews 11 verse 1? Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. How's your faith getting on today? What's your next step of faith along that cycle? Where are you stuck? Where do you want to move on in God's purposes and plans for you. Because one thing's for sure, He wants you to move on. He wants you to go round, take that next step. Maybe you need to go away this afternoon and just think about, what is that next step? Is it to hear God for the first time properly? And to take that step of faith and trust in Him for the first time. Maybe it's the nth time of trusting God, but it's just something a bit bigger and you've been putting it off. Remember something. God is absolutely faithful. He will not let you down. As Ali and the band come back, we're going to sing Great Is Thy Faithfulness. And let's just pray as they come back down. Father, we just thank you for your love and your goodness to us. Thank you that you long to give us blessings, wonderful blessings. Thank you that you want the very best for us. And you simply ask us to walk in faith and be obedient. Help us to just remember your faithfulness, that you are unchanging and we can trust you again, just as Abraham did. Amen.